Why the Iranian government should be more worried today than it has been during past waves of protest. On the surface, the demonstrations may look similar to earlier unrest, streets filled with people chanting, marketplaces closing, and the familiar patterns of crackdowns and arrests. But beneath that surface, the dynamics are strikingly different, and the stakes feel higher for those in power. To understand this fear, we need to look at the interplay of three major factors: the breadth of participation, the underlying causes, and the erosion of legitimacy that has been quietly building for years. In previous protest waves, there were usually clear, contained triggers: a sudden spike in fuel prices, a controversial law, or the tragic death of a young woman. These events sparked outrage, drew attention, and sometimes mobilized large crowds. But often, the unrest remained concentrated among specific groups: students, women's rights activists, laborers, or urban middle classes. The government could respond by focusing enforcement on those areas, making an example of a few leaders, and using limited media narratives to contain the story. The protests today are different. The grievances are not limited to one issue or one demographic. They touch almost every part of Iranian society. Shopkeepers, factory workers, students, professionals, retirees, and ordinary families all feel the pressure of economic collapse. Inflation has made daily life precarious. Wages lag behind rising costs, and the cost of housing, healthcare, and food has surged beyond what most families can manage. This economic desperation has made participation in protests more likely across age, class, and region. What makes the government particularly uneasy is the scale and unpredictability of this participation. When protests involve a single social group, the authorities can anticipate patterns: where people will march, what slogans they will use, and how to respond. Today, protests are spontaneous and widespread, appearing in cities large and small, sometimes in neighborhoods that had previously remained quiet. Even without a centralized leadership, the demonstrations are coordinated enough to sustain momentum. At the same time, the demands have broadened. They are no longer just about economic relief. Protesters are expressing frustration with corruption, demanding greater accountability, and in some cases, challenging the legitimacy of the system itself. This creates a dilemma for the government. Conceding on economic matters alone might calm the streets temporarily, but it does not address political discontent. Responding with force risks amplifying anger and drawing international attention. Every choice carries consequences. One of the most significant reasons for the regime's fear is the role of the younger generation. Iran's population is young. Many under 35 have grown up without seeing meaningful reform or opportunity. They are digitally connected, aware of global standards of life, and increasingly frustrated with restrictions on freedom, opportunity, and mobility. Unlike older generations who may have tolerated hardship for stability, many young Iranians are unwilling to accept that trade-off. Their determination, combined with access to mobile technology, allows protests to spread quickly even when traditional media is blocked. This digital connectivity is another source of anxiety for the government. Internet restrictions and messaging app bans have been attempted repeatedly, yet protesters have found ways to communicate, coordinate, and document events. Videos and images of demonstrations circulate rapidly, both inside Iran and across the global diaspora. The government fears not only the spread of unrest internally, but also its amplification externally, which can increase pressure on the regime from foreign governments and media outlets. Another factor intensifying the fear is the depth of frustration with governance. Years of mismanagement, corruption, and misallocation of resources have eroded trust. Citizens feel that decisions are made to benefit elites, military organizations, or foreign agendas, rather than ordinary families. When legitimacy is questioned at this level, even small triggers can ignite large-scale unrest. Unlike protests motivated by a single event, these movements are fueled by a pervasive sense of injustice, making them harder to control or suppress. Ethnic and regional dynamics also contribute to the government's concern. Iran is home to diverse populations, including Kurds, Baluch, Azeris, Arabs, and others, many of whom have long histories of marginalization. When nationwide protests emerge, these groups may interpret unrest as an opportunity to voice long-standing grievances. The convergence of multiple social, ethnic, and economic frustrations creates a mosaic of pressure that is much harder to contain than protests limited to a single group. The government is also acutely aware of the historical memory of protest movements. Over the past 50 years, Iran has experienced cycles of mobilization and suppression. Leaders know that when anger accumulates and participation spreads widely, repression alone is rarely enough to resolve the underlying crisis. They have seen popular movements grow, shrink, and then re-emerge stronger, often with international attention reinforcing domestic momentum. This historical awareness creates an added layer of anxiety. They recognize that failing to address deeper causes risk recurring unrest that could challenge their grip on power. A further complication is international perception. While protesters are primarily focused on domestic issues, the world is watching. Videos of demonstrations, arrests, and crackdowns are quickly circulated globally. Governments and human rights organizations respond, which can create diplomatic and economic pressure. Even the perception that the state is losing control can embolden more people to join protests, creating a feedback loop that authorities find deeply threatening. The combination of these factors, widespread participation, cross-generational mobilization, economic collapse, political grievances, ethnic diversity, digital communication, and international visibility, is what sets this moment apart from previous waves of unrest. It is not any single element that worries the government most, but the convergence of many elements simultaneously, making the protests unpredictable and difficult to suppress with traditional methods. This unpredictability is amplified by the lack of clear leadership within the protests. While previous movements sometimes had clear leaders or organizations that authorities could pressure, this wave is decentralized. Leaders are not always publicly visible, and coordination is often horizontal rather than hierarchical. That makes repression more complicated. Targeting one group or individual is unlikely to stop the movement, and broad crackdowns risk escalating anger rather than containing it. Economic factors remain central to this anxiety. Inflation, currency collapse, and rising living costs affect everyone, including government employees and families connected to state institutions. When even those close to the system feel the pinch, loyalty becomes fragile. The government knows that prolonged economic distress can weaken internal cohesion, create divisions among elites, and make enforcement of authority more difficult. The psychological dimension cannot be ignored either. Protests signal to the authorities that the social contract is fraying. Citizens are no longer willing to accept hardship quietly, and visible defiance inspires others. The more the movement spreads and persists, the more fear accumulates within the state apparatus. Even if they retain ultimate control militarily, the sense of losing legitimacy can be destabilizing in the long term. In short, the Iranian government fears these protests because they are broad, persistent, and rooted in structural issues that cannot be fixed overnight. Unlike short-lived unrest triggered by a single event, these demonstrations challenge the assumptions that the state can maintain control through force, messaging, or limited concessions alone. The risk is not just disruption of daily life, it is a questioning of authority and legitimacy that could shape Iran's future in fundamental ways. These protests, therefore, are not just another episode in Iran's history, they are a signal of a deeper transformation in the relationship between citizens and the state. For the government, the fear is not simply about the streets being full of demonstrators, but about the potential for long-term shifts in power, influence, and trust. And that is why, more than at any other time in recent memory, the authorities are watching carefully, strategizing cautiously, and acknowledging privately the gravity of the moment. Because these protests are not just loud, they are wide, persistent, and impossible to ignore. And in that reality, the government's fear is both understandable and telling.